Tonight's panel, presented by the Jewish Community Council of Victoria in partnership with the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, will look at the historic Black-Jewish civil rights partnership in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, BDS and Antisemitism. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we usually meet and where we are running this webinar from, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. The Jewish Community Council of Victoria and the Executive Council of Australian Jewry oppose racism, and at this historic time for civil rights and for the American black community in particular, we express our support for black Americans in their struggle against institutional racism, including police brutality. We also acknowledge the disproportionately large number of Indigenous Australians in custody and far too many Indigenous deaths in custody here in Australia. There are historic ties between black civil rights and Jewish civil rights movements in America. The two communities have been long-term partners at the forefront of the American civil rights movement. Today, the American Jewish community remains committed to this partnership, speaking up early and strong in support of the idea and slogan that Black Lives Matter. Unlike the black civil rights movement of the past, the Black Lives Matter movement has not made the fight against anti-Semitism a key point of solidarity. Instead, the movement behind the slogan has embraced policies and people who promote anti-Jewish and anti-Israel agendas, including those from the anti-Israel BDS movement. Our panel of experts will take a deep and nuanced look at the black civil rights of the past and the contrast between the Black Lives Matter movement today and other black civil rights organisations. Our speakers are Joshua Washington, a black American civil rights activist, Olga Menashu Washington, a black South African political activist, and Dan Diker, an American-Israeli analyst and Jewish leader. I'm Andre Obler, and I'll be your moderator this evening. Institutional racism has a long history around the world, including in both the United States and Australia. The lack of accountability of those wielding the power of state, particularly police, is a key part of that institutional racism. In the United States, there is an additional legacy from the history of slavery which plays a significant part in the history and origin of the black American community, as well as the history of the United States more broadly. Many of the protests in the United States during the civil rights movement of the 1960s were directly about police brutality. In one example, in 1965, in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, an attempt to arrest a young black American man escalated into community violence. In the resulting riots, 34 people, most black Americans, lost their lives. More recently, in 1992 in Los Angeles, the acquittal of 4 police officers charged with the brutal beating of Rodney King, a black man, led to 6 days of rioting in which 63 people were killed and 2,383 injured. A later federal government prosecution of the officers led to 2 of them being convicted and serving time in prison. The Black Lives Matter movement started in 2013 as a hashtag on social media. This followed the acquittal of the officer who fatally shot Trayvon Martin, a black man who was unarmed at the time of the shooting. In 2014, the fatal shooting of Michael Brown Jr., an 18-year-old black man by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, led to a real-world response from the until then online Black Matters protesters. They organised a national Black Lives Matter ride, and some 600 people travelled to protest in Ferguson. They committed to both supporting the ongoing protest in Ferguson and taking the protest home with them. The protest spread to 170 cities. The movement continued to grow over the years, but it was the murder of George Floyd, a black American man, on May 26th this year, which led to a global outpouring of support against institutional racism against black Americans. The protests were led under the Black Lives Matter movement banner and occurred in over 2,000 cities and towns across more than 60 countries. Online activism against police brutality and a lack of accountability of the police continues online, and as has been the case since 2012, it is expressed with the slogan Black Lives Matter. The institutional racism against black Americans, as well as activism against it, was there well before the rise of Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter slogan is a social media phenomena and a thing that we can all support, but it is also a real-world movement. It is that movement and its activities beyond protesting police violence and advocating for the civil rights of black Americans, which will be discussed by our speakers. So, the reason I provided the background I've just given is that we want to highlight that there is a very real issue about civil rights of Black Americans, and then there is the Black Lives Matter movement. The two are two related but different things, and we need to make that clear as we move into this talk. The actual civil rights of Black Americans and the need to stand up against racism is something the Jewish community here and abroad clearly supports. Issues of anti-Semitism, however, and attacks on our community are, of course, also concerning to us. And that's really the topic of today when we start talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and BDS and the relationship between the two of them. I'm not going to get into that, but our speakers will. So our panel today includes Dan Diker, who's the director of the Political Warfare Project at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at the IDC. He is a past Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, and prior to that served as the World Jewish Congress Director for Strategic Affairs and Middle Eastern Advisor on Policy and Diplomacy. He's a regular media commentator on Israeli and Middle Eastern affairs for a range of networks, and the author of a number of books related to the BDS movement. The most recent of these, I haven't got the details there, but I'll let Dan introduce his books as well. Olga Manischewitz-Washington is Chief Executive Officer of the International Defense Embrace Invest in Support Israel organization. Her unique narrative on South African and African relations with Israel, the Christian mandate to stand with Israel, and her engaging delivery have contributed to Olga being a regular on the speakers circuit in Africa and the United States. Parable magazine named Olga one of South Africa's 2011 influential young Christian leaders, and in 2016 she received the 2016 Jerusalem Award from the World Zionist Organization in recognition of advocacy for the State of Israel and the South African Jewish community. Joshua Washington is the director of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. He writes and speaks extensively on civil rights and Zionism and works to strengthen the Black and Jewish relationship. He is a composition graduate of the University of Pacific Conservatory of Music and an alumni of the Christians United for Israel Diversity Outreach Mentoring Endeavor. Yeah. Outside of IBSI, he has directed a K-12 music school called the Zion Academy of Music, arranging music for the Boston Pops, and provided music directing for other artists and films, including Kufi's Mizrahi project. To start off, I'd like to hand over to Joshua to give us a little bit of background on the civil rights movement and the issues facing Black Americans, and then leading into where Black Lives Matter has come from and how it relates, starting to the BDS movement, although we'll leave it to Dan to fill us in more detail on BDS. Joshua, thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Thanks for having me, and it's really good to be here. I'll be giving some more context on the broader history of Black Americans, Black Jewish relations, Zionism in the Black community, and then if there's time at the end, I'll come back and actually kind of bring some stuff together for where we are now. So first of all, when we're talking about Black Jewish relations, usually the thing that gets talked about the most, at least in America, is Martin Luther King and his pro-Israel stance, and Martin Luther King and Rabbi Joshua Heschel. For me, if I were to pick two figures that really exemplified Black Jewish relations, I would go a little bit further back to the 30s, and I would pick Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, because it was those two people together. Booker T. Washington was a Black teacher, intellectual. He was a thought leader. He was written many books. One of his most famous books is called Up From Slavery. He talks about his journey from being a slave to being the successful, well-known intellectual that he is. And Julius Rosenwald, who was a rich man. He was a business owner. Their relationship actually goes further back at the early 1900s, around 1912. And Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington teamed up together. Rosenwald reaches out to Washington because of the books that he read from him. He was inspired, and he said, "I want to build a school. I want to build a school for young Black kids," because at the time Black kids weren't allowed to learn in white schools. And they not only built that school, but they wound up building over 5,000 schools together across the East and the segregated South. And if it was not for Washington and Rosenwald, my deepest belief is that there would be no figures like Martin Luther King. There would be no figures like Rosa Parks, like Representative John Lewis. There would be, we wouldn't have Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes. Some of these people were students or recipients of scholarships from these schools, and others were just they just were on the receiving end of this wave of Black intellectualism. That our literacy rate jumped up drastically when these schools were built. There even now, where I'm standing today, speaking with all of you, is a result of what happened with those schools. Hundreds of thousands of kids being educated, going on to being doctors, lawyers, scientists, speakers, authors, poets, all those things. And so to me, that's where, for me in this country, that's kind of where, that's the linchpin of Black-Jewish relations. When you fast forward to the 60s, when we talk about Martin Luther King, one of the things that Dr. King was really big on was justice, obviously, but also he was a Zionist. And in 1968 or 1967, when Dr. King was at the Rabbinical Assembly, he was speaking with the rabbi who was asking him all these questions, and the interview is very, very interesting. It's very fascinating. The transcript is still online. You can find it. The rabbi is asking him all these kind of questions, from racism to the foreign relations in the U.S. and then they wind up touching on Israel in the Jewish community. And one of the things that the rabbi asked Martin Luther King, he wanted him to speak on the racism that existed within some in the Jewish community toward Black Americans, and the anti-Semitism that existed within some in the Black community toward the Jewish community. And Dr. King, he was very succinct. He was very sensitive as he was talking about this, and he walked through these things. And one of the things that he said was that, yes, unfortunately, there are some store owners that, many store owners in the segregated South, they charge he says a Black tax, meaning that the stuff in their shop, they sell to Black Americans for a little bit more than what they would sell it to their white counterparts. And he says, yes, unfortunately, some of those people are Jewish. He said, but we have to understand that, one, it doesn't represent the whole community, and actually they're not operating within their Jewish ethics, is what he said. And he said, similarly, there are some in the Black community who are color consumed, and they see a sort of a mystique in being colored and being Black, and anything that's not colored is condemned. And he said, we don't follow that course. And he was speaking to both of those things. And one of the things he said was, I think the best way to approach these things is to seek justice wherever it is. He said, we may see injustices going on in our own community, in the Black community, and we have to call it out. And when he gets to Israel, he talks about how Israel obviously is, he says that it's an oasis of brotherhood and democracy in the Middle East. He sees Israel, he talks about how he sees Israel as this light to the nations, and that peace for Israel means security. And then he kind of talks more about what peace for the Arab side of things means for them as well. And the reason why the rabbi was asking Martin Luther King these questions was because there was this growing and tense tide of, it was still small, but it was growing, this growing tide of anti-Semitism in the Black community. It wasn't just Black people who were politically opposed to Israel, but there were Black people who were very anti-Semitic. There were civil rights movements that drastically, almost overnight, turned and became very anti-Israel. And that, I mean, that's a longer message. There was some hijacking that was going on. There was definitely some intentional messaging directed at the Black community from Palestinian leadership. But you start to see some of these these big name, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, publishing this document that has these 32 different lies that they're telling about Israel with no evidence to back up anything that they're saying. But some of these lies are things that we still hear today. They call them documented facts, but one of the things they talk about is, did you know that Israel indiscriminately kills Palestinian children and they're committing genocide? Did you know that Israel controls all of the wealth that goes in and out of Africa, and they're keeping the continent disenfranchised, and things like that. Did you know that Israel, controls most countries in the world, and they have their hand in a lot of different things. So this was something, a message that was put out by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that really shocked the Jewish community. They had a lot of support from the Jewish community, and literally it almost felt like overnight, as I was combing through this, that this happened, and a lot of Jewish people pulled their support, pulled their funding from the SNCC because they felt betrayed, and rightly so. And I think that a big part of this is, there has been, and since then, even coming to now, there has been this intentional targeting of minority groups, especially Black Americans, to hop onto a cause, because anytime Black Americans can lend their voice to a cause, it gives it that much more power. There are things that we've gone through in our history that have given us that, we have our countries, we have the world's ear sometimes as well. I mean, and that's one of the things that causes us to be subject to, targeting and messaging. So after that convention that Dr. King spoke at in 1968, 10 days later, he was assassinated. And you start to see more of this kind of ramp up of anti-Semitism in the Black community. When we go to 1975, Bayard Rustin, who's Martin Luther King's right-hand man, one of his closest associates, he formed an organization called BASIC. BASIC stands for Black Americans Supporting Israel Committee. And again, like Dr. King, he forms this in the face of what he sees as this solidarity between Black Americans and the PLO, which he detested and he came against. He wrote numerous articles exposing Yasser Arafat. He wrote an article in particular appealing and imploring the Black community to not stand with him, telling us that we lose our moral voice by locking arms with Yasser Arafat. And BASIC was formed to stand in solidarity with Israel, but also to point out what was actually happening with the Palestinians and what true Palestinian self-determination actually looks like. And so BASIC it had a lot of signatures from a lot of big name Black Americans at the time: Hank Aaron, Rosa Parks, Coretta Scott King, Lionel Hampton. You have these big jazz musicians, athletes, other civil rights activists, Martin Luther King Sr. And this was a true, Black Jewish solidarity movement, if there ever was one. And one of the things that, like I said, one of the things that it did was that it stood in the face of anti-Semitism in the Black community. And it says, no, we're not going to let you treat the Jewish community this way. We've always been connected in our struggles. Back when Black people weren't allowed to learn in white schools, there were some HBCUs that brought on Jewish professors and Jewish students to teach and to learn alongside the Black students, because Jews weren't seen as white people. They were seen as just as at the bottom of the pole as Black people were. And so we were often treated very similarly.
Joshua, you said
yes, sir.
HBCUs.
Yeah, sorry. I let me tell you that. Historically, Black colleges and universities. So there were Black colleges. We still have them now, but at the time when they were built, it was because Black people weren't allowed to learn in schools, in white schools. So at the time, those colleges also had Jewish students in them and Jewish professors in them because they weren't allowed as well. So our struggles have always been connected. And our triumphs have also been very connected as well. I mean, like I said, Washington and Rosenwald, they actually spawned an entire generation of educated Black people. Martin Luther King's work in the Jewish community is what helped push our struggle forward, you know. And the more that we continue to keep that relationship going, I think the more we'll be able to move forward as a community. And unfortunately, and I'll let Dan continue talking, and I'll come back a little bit later, but you know, what we're seeing now is not that. It's actually the opposite of that when it comes to Black people in the Jewish community. And for many reasons, it's one of the reasons why we haven't been moving forward as a community. Since 2013, when BLM started, it hasn't really made strides at all. And it's because their platforms they're coming from platforms of division, particularly in the Jewish community.
So Joshua, thank you very much. On that note, I think we will now pass across to Dan to perhaps first introduce us to BDS. Many people know something about it, but let's just explain what that is first and then go through to the connection on BDS and Black Lives Matter. Okay, thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joshua. I'm going to, if I just sum up in a half a sentence of Joshua's point, I think is the beginning at the beginning of last century, beginning of the 20th century. Certainly in the United States, the Black American Jewish Alliance has been really rock solid. And there, as an American Israeli, I can say from my own professional experience and personal experience that the movement for justice for all American minorities, out of our own personal experience as Jews, has really motivated us to ally with the great leaders in the Black American community, particularly when we started with Booker T. Washington, we moved on to Martin Luther King Jr. So that has been a rock solid alliance for many decades, and that is why, in a sharp transition to what we're seeing today, we're seeing a very worrying convergence between two political movements. Andre started out these remarks by saying that the Black Lives Matter movement, what's called BLM, and its network of 50 or so sub-organizations that are under the BLM tent, represents today not only a slogan, Andre, that was your first note. It's a slogan, meaning Black Lives Matter, as they certainly do, and all major Jewish organizations, as Peter and Robert Gut know very much, as being senior executives of the largest Jewish political organization in the world, has always stood out and spoken out on the issue, on the slogan, and on the content of Black Lives Matter, clearly, and for other minorities as well. But what we're seeing now is the movement from a human rights and civil rights slogan, which everyone agrees with, to a very particular political movement, an online crusade. And it's the political movement and online crusade that has co-opted the concept of Black Lives Matter that has become very worrying. Worrying for the United States, I think, as a country, and worrying for the Jewish community specifically. We're seeing the convergence between Black Lives Matter as a political movement, which by its own self-definition is a neo-Marxist movement. The leaders of those movements, I've just done a major research paper on this. You're very much welcome to read it. You can go on to jcpa.org and just put in Dan Diker and BLM, and it'll come up. And we spent a good couple of weeks, about a month or month and a half ago, taking a look at the political movement called BLM. And originally what we were going to do, the thesis was that the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which, as you all know, was formally launched in 2004, just a few years after the Durban Conference, which basically held that Israel was an apartheid illicit, illegitimate, criminal, genocidal, imperialistic, and colonialistic state, and really had no right to exist. That was the crusade that the former PLO chairman Yasser Arafat had created with his South African allies who had just come out several years earlier of the apartheid era. Now we fast forward to 2020, and what we saw with the killing of George Floyd was an igniting, an intensification of what we saw with Yasser Arafat and in South Africa back in 2001, and then subsequently known as the BDS movement. The BDS movement, as you know, is an eliminationist movement, friends, on this call. The BDS movement is not a movement of political criticism. It is a movement of total eliminationism, an eliminationist movement of the nation state of the Jewish people as we know it today, and its replacement with another state called Palestine. And this was not well recognized until 2015-16, that BDS was not a movement of political criticism, but a movement of political replacement. And that's why we suggested in a number of the research papers and books that I've done that it is the newest form of what was known as replacement theology. In Catholicism, we call it political replacement theology as the essence of what BDS is. Now we move forward to the terrible, tragic, intolerable murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, which was clearly a case of police brutality. The fact that it was a white policeman and Mr. Floyd is a Black American is again another example of two Americans of different races in a tragic what became a tragic event. However, just for a moment of context, the vast majority, according to the best poll done in 2016-2017 by the University of Maryland, 54% of all police brutality cases are white on white, 27% are white cops on black, and 17% are white cops or cops on Hispanic. So what we're seeing here is, Josh called it the colorization. I mean, we're talking about definitely a desperate cries for racial justice from Black Americans. But as a political movement, the Black Lives Movement, by its own admission, is a radical movement. It's not a reformist movement. It's a movement that wants to destroy the existing order. And if you'd like a proof to what I'm saying, just listen to any of the YouTubes of Professor Mark Lamont Hill, who's one of the strategic and intellectual advisors of the BLM and the BLM movement, and even the more radical movement for Black Lives, which has now partnered with the BDS movement. And it is calling for really the destruction, not only the dismantling of police departments, but the destruction of local governments, the establishment of autonomous zones, as you saw one in Seattle being erected, and as well as the dismantling of the state of Israel. Now, you might ask, what the devil does all this have to do with Israel? And this is a domestic, racial, civil human rights issue in the United States. Well, some of you may have known that just some weeks ago, just after the murder of George Floyd, a petition was circulated on the internet by a student group, a BDS student group, by the University of California system, calling for not only the boycott, but the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid genocidal state, because Israel, as the charge went, supplied police training to the Minneapolis Police Department, as well as a number of other police departments around the United States. Well, the truth of the matter is that the state of Israel for some years has offered counterterrorism counseling and strategic advice in Israel to some law enforcement agencies having to do with counterterrorism. It has nothing to do with policing, nothing to do with crowd control, riot control, arrest techniques. So this accusation, this mendacious accusation that was made on the petition by the University of California Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a Palestinian-led movement to dismantle Israel from abroad, basically connected with the racially charged deep emotions of the BLM political movement. So now you have the state of Israel deeply embedded against its will in what is a domestic racial civil rights human rights social justice type of movement. Now, what's dangerous about this for diaspora Jewry, and let's start with American Jewry, is that it takes the typical liberal progressive approach of American Jews, and perhaps by extension to the other English-speaking countries, the same type of liberal progressive worldview, and it cancels it out, meaning you cannot be a supporter of the Jewish state if you're a Jewish individual living in these areas, certainly in the United States, because the mainstream discourse today, if we can measure the mainstream discourse by the hundreds of demonstrations and protests that have been held since May 25th, 2020, in the murder of George Floyd, has been that Israel is essentially a white supremacist implant in the Middle East with no inherent right to exist, that essentially stole the country of an indigenous population called Palestine, and is now complicit in the murder of African Americans. That's where we are today. This has been the de-evolution of the discourse on Israel. I call it in the paper the racialization of Israel. The discourse, if you listen to the founders of the Black Lives Movement political discourse, you will see them talking about Israel today in pre-67 lines as 48. They call Israel 48, and they refer to dismantling pre-67 Israel, and then co-joining that with the West Bank and Gaza, by the way, which they hold is under occupation, regardless of the unilateral pullout in 2005. And so therefore, Israel as a white supremacist entity has no right to exist and must be replaced in the same way that local police and government in the United States must be dismantled and then rebuilt from the ground up. This is called the racialization of Israel, meaning Israel is a white country without any solution other than its dismantling. It's being dismantled and replaced. And I find this worrying and dangerous for diaspora Jewry, because it means that any diaspora Jew, according to this discourse that is really bleeding into the mainstream discourse, and certainly a mainstream and principal mainstay of the online crusade, if you show any amenability, never mind support, but amenability to the state of Israel, you become by definition a white supremacist and targeted for violence and for approbation. You may notice if you go onto the internet right now on your cell phone, take a look at what's going on in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where the Chabad synagogue was defaced in the last 10 hours with Free Palestine, having to do, this is following the killing of Jacob, I think his name is Jacob Brody, and then the following shootings and ensuing violence. So all of a sudden you see it's this freeing that Israel and the Palestinian issue becomes embedded in this very violent confrontation between these communities in the United States. So I think that the implications are very dangerous for diaspora Jewry, and I think that it really behooves us to think very carefully about to what level of tolerance do Jews demonstrate when, in the name of anti-racism, the Black Lives Matter political movement, they're co-joining with the BDS eliminationist movement, essentially threaten the very progressive and liberal worldviews of major Jewish organizations. Many of you know that Ronald Lauder, President Lauder, Ambassador Lauder, the President of World Jewish Congress, was one of the first to come out against the Floyd murders, followed by the ADL, the Reform movement, the conservative movement. There was wall-to-wall support for anti-racism and for Mr. Floyd's family, and condemnation of the Floyd murder. And the stark contrast between these acts of anti-Semitism that we saw in Fairfax, California, in New York, in Portland, in Chicago, violence against Jews, defacement of synagogues, these are understood within the political context of Black Lives Matter as an extension of the so-called racial justice, social justice movements. And it's here that I think we have to be very morally clear about what we're seeing. because there's no contradiction between being pro-Black Lives Matter as a slogan and as a concept, but being very vigilant and very strict about the extension and the bleeding into rank anti-Semitism, political violence, social violence against Jews and Jewish institutions. And I'll finish by saying just the opening comments by noting that the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and the president of that, or the executive director of that, who was a J Street person, is now on the target list of over 100 anti-Zionist BLM and BDS friendly organizations because they're considered liberal, meaning they're in favor of Martin Luther King's decolorization, the notion of that everyone is equal and color should be invisible, as Dr. King said, is the content of our character, not the color of our skin. That has been an ADL principle for decades, and now ADL is on the target list because it is not moved into the radical discourse of dismantling and destroying, rebuilding in the image of Black Lives Matter. So I think that we have to live with this paradox, and we have to be very vigilant and strict as an international Jewish community to stand up against anti-Semitism, to call it out very firmly where it exists, and not to tolerate it in the name of social justice. You may see in some of these, I don't know if you've seen very disturbing videos of people threatening Jewish and young white couples who refuse to get on their knee and hold up their fist for the Black Lives Movement political statement. And this is where I think we're seeing a move into Marxist totalitarianism, and this matches very much the type of declaration that we're hearing from the Black Lives Matter and the BDS movement leaderships together. So it's not that we are accusing them of something that they are not taking credit for themselves. And I think we ought to be very morally clear as to what the dangers of these movements pose in terms of intersectionality, the union of the oppressed, and the call for violence against the Jewish state, against sovereign Jews, as well as Christians and Muslims, by the way, who are Israelis, because they're calling for the dismantling of the entire democratic state of Israel, not just against the Jews. So, and I will just say finally that Joshua and Olga and I are working right now on, I think, a very important initiative called Promise, which is the re-energizing of the Black American Jewish or Israel relationship, focusing on Israel's help with Africa, focusing on Israel's relationship with the Black American leadership, and trying to re-energize that. We invite you to join us in this a great, very important initiative. And I think that that's where we need to get back to the principles of Reverend Martin Luther King, and away from this polarizing and radicalized discourse that we are seeing in almost every many major American cities today. Thank you, Andre.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. We'll pass over to Olga now, and particularly focus, although Olga, please feel free to comment on the other issues as well. But if we can particularly dive into that apartheid discussion that's been going on, and how that's been built into the narrative. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Andre, and good morning or good evening to everybody, depending on where you are in the world. It's a great privilege to be part of this panel, and it's always wonderful to be on a panel with Dan Diker, as well as Joshua David Washington, who, if you haven't made the correlation, is my husband. I'm very grateful to have somebody who believes as strongly on something so important as I do. So, as Andre has mentioned, I'm going to speak specifically with regards to the apartheid narrative and how it has found its way into the BDS movement, which has now then found its way into the BLM movement, and unfortunately, for very nefarious, very dangerous reasons. One of the things that Dan mentioned with regards to this project called Promise that we're looking at is not only just energizing, but I would like to highlight the fact is that there's going to be a great emphasis on education. And why education, you may say? Education because many of the people that we see on the streets have no idea as to either what the Black Lives Matter movement is, or who Israel is, or what the Black American-Israel relationship was. and now, more importantly, with regards to where I'm sitting down, what apartheid is. And so they're wanting to be part of this cause, but have no understanding that, in fact, instead of doing something good, contributing to something good, they're actually doing more harm. So I'm a native South African, even though I now live in the United States. And being South African, this particular topic is close to my heart because, ladies and gents, if I may say, from the very beginning, it is trivializing the pain that Black South Africans went through. It is taking a cause that has nothing to do with the democratic state of Israel, the only beacon of democracy in the Middle East, and it's using it for nefarious causes. Once on another panel, I said, you know what, if you're going to take the apartheid narrative, confuse it and do something good with it. So you really want to see the fact that the people of Palestine who are being oppressed, ladies and gents, let's be honest about that, they are being oppressed. If you wanted to take that and highlight their oppression and call to account the real oppressors, who are their leaders? The PLO, the PA, Hamas, and call those people to account. But yeah, maybe I'll forgive, but that's not what's happening. BDS, even though the whole movement to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, which is what BDS stands for, even though it was formally formed in the year 2005, we could see its origins, its workings already prior to the establishment of Israel in 1948. But then it took on a more formal role with the Arab leaders post-1948 because they then wanted themselves to have nothing to do with Israel, but then also nations of the world to have nothing to do with Israel. So Israel was supposed to be this pariah on the international scene. Fast forward to the year 2001, and what was supposed to be the United Nations conference held in Durban, South Africa, so a place where you're looking at real human rights issues, real issues that are impacting the world. Somehow in that conference, we then came out with a statement. When I say we, the people at the conference, came out with a statement that said, Israel is an apartheid state, and to use some of the phrases that we use, Dan has already used them. Israel is a racist, Israel is colonialist, Israel is an imperialist state. And what that has now happened over the years is that we have moved the discourse, we've moved the conversation, almost we've also moved the cry, seemingly, for the Palestinian people to have their own state, for the Palestinian people to have self-determination with regards to a specific area of land, or just land generally. That discourse no longer exists. We've now moved the discourse to a place that if we want the Palestinian people, or any people now across the world, because the BLM movement has now adopted this notion, to have any sort of justice, racial justice, that Israel has to be called an apartheid state because that is who she is. So the question is now the question is now no longer about where should people live, how should people live together in a democracy, or from a governance perspective, but there now needs to be this freedom from racial injustice, there now needs to be this freedom from oppression, there now needs to be this freedom based on the color of our skin. Now, when you look at what apartheid South Africa was, it was a systematic system, ladies and gentlemen, from the year 1948 all the way through to the year 1994, that deliberately, specifically, with the intention to separate people purely for the color of their skin, had over 150 pieces of legislation put in place to ensure that there was this structural separation. And I say purely because of the color of our skin. You look at me, I'm dark skinned. My hair, a lot more kinky, it's not soft and it's not wavy. There was something that was called the pencil test. I'm telling you the truth. They would take a pencil, put it into black people's hair. If the pencil fell out, ladies and gents, you were black. You were then separated. You had to live in a particular area. If the pencil stayed in, there we go, that stayed in, you were black. If it fell out, you were white. And you then had to live in a particular area. The basis of our separation, the basis of these laws, was because black people were seen as inferior. And because we were inferior as human beings, we could not climb up the echelons of social power or of social learnings. Our education system, by law, ladies and gents, was structured so that we could only learn things that would help us fulfill our role in society. And what was our role in society during the apartheid years? It was to be workers. It was to be laborers. It was to be servants, because that was all that we were good for. Again, purely because of the color of our skin. My parents could not go to the same schools. Black people could not go to the same schools. When I was born, I could not go to the same schools as other white people could go, again, because of the color of my skin. We did not receive the same facilities from a health perspective. I remember when Daisy took its first tour of young people to Israel, they got on the bus, and here we had a Jewish tour guide with an Arab driver. And the young people looked at this and they were like, wait, we've just stepped off the airplane. And here we were met with a scene that we would have never seen in apartheid South Africa. Every form of transportation that we used in Israel was not based on the color of a person's skin. We saw Arabs, we saw Israelis, we saw people who were of dark skin, we saw people who were in light skin. My father now serves in South Africa's parliament, which is the equivalent of the Israeli Knesset. As a black man, that was impossible during the day in apartheid. Ladies and gents, there were laws also that didn't just regulate where Africans lived, black people lived. We had these documents called dompasses, and people that tried to make the correlation between Israel being an apartheid state, just like South Africa was, will say that the Palestinian people have to show these documentation to go through the checkpoint. And so that is apartheid. And so where it is an unfortunate thing that we have these checkpoints, or that we have the barrier, it's not a wall. There's no apartheid wall. Where we have this barrier, the basis for that barrier in Israel, as we know, is for security reasons. Ladies and gents, the basis for these dorm passes in South Africa, again, purely for the color of your skin, black people were given permission to live in certain areas of the country based on where they were working and what type of work they did. That was it. It was for labor purposes only. My birth certificate, even though I was born in the capital of South Africa, my birth certificate at the time, it's been changed, thankfully, but my birth certificate at the time did not give me South African citizenship, even though I was born in the capital of South Africa. Why? Because of the color of my skin, and also because of the tribe that I came from. Again, that was apartheid South Africa. I can go through many other examples. So this whole notion, ladies and gents, that has been used by the BDS and now has found its way into BLM is not just a complete lie that does a disservice to what Black South Africans went through. There would have been no need for the liberation of Black South Africans, or just South Africans generally. There would have been no Nelson Mandela like we know him today. So not only is it doing a disservice to the history of South Africa, but it's not accomplishing anything with regards to what they're saying they want to do. Show me how the BDS movement has helped the Palestinian cause. Show me how it's helped them actually receive the funding that the international world has given them. Show me how it's brought their leaders to account who've been pimping off. And that's an article that my husband and I recently looked at, in terms of how the Palestinian people have just been a tool used by their leaders to get rich. Show me how it's helped that. And now, if we're looking in America, show me how calling Israel an apartheid state is helping the cause and the cries with regards to racial inequality or racial injustices here in the United States. I agree with the fact that there are challenges here in the United States. There are challenges across the world. No country is perfect. There is racism in every single country. But to utilize this particular narrative, there is no intention, in my humble opinion, other than to use the pain of Black Americans at this time to continue to delegitimize and demonize Israel. Many decades ago, when there were cries to free South Africa, those cries were for the purposes of seeing the dismantling of a system. That a system, a political system that was in place had to be fair, had to be equal. Now when we see these cries, so BLM is about Black people here in the United States, there are injustices, but then at the same time they're shouting free Palestine. And when you ask them, okay, why free Palestine? Free Palestine because Israel has no right to exist. So those cries have now been adapted to actually see the destruction of the legitimate state of Israel. And with that, history tells us, we'll also see, and it's being proven here in the United States, an increase in anti-Semitic attacks in the United States. If I can close off with this, I challenge anybody who says, yes, the BLM and the movement for Black Lives Matter, there's no difference between the two, really are helping Black people. And so because there's oppression across the world, we shouldn't just, and it's a comment that I've heard, say that they need to stay within the confines of the American country. They need to show solidarity with any people across the world. And so there is a legitimacy to show solidarity with the plight of the Palestinian people. As an African, as a Black woman, I ask, where is Black Lives Matter in Africa? Protesting the Libyan slave trade, which is happening right now, where you can find a healthy grown man for $200. Where are they? Where is the BLM protesting about the genocide against Christian Nigerians taking place today? by Boko Haram? Where are their voices? Where are their voices if you say that Black Lives Matter and that Black Lives Matter outside of the borders of the United States? Where are they with regards to the growing terrorism that's taking place in Southern Africa and slowly creeping in to a place that I call home still? Where are they?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm looking at the time, and we are going to hit our time limit in 7 minutes. I do want to come back to Joshua for 5 minutes to wrap up. That's part of our original plan. If people are happy staying a few minutes over for some questions, we have some in the chat. And I'd also like to invite anyone else that wants to ask a question, if you can put it in the chat while Joshua finishes up. And then I'll call on you to go through your question. And please, if you've put a question in, think about which of our speakers you want to ask it to. I don't think we're going to have time to get every speaker to comment on every question, or we'll be here a further hour. So choose who you want to ask your question to. And after Joshua's done, we'll start going through those questions. Okay, Joshua, over to
Andre,
you.
I think we can stay for 10 or 15 additional minutes if people are interested in staying, not to take people's time, but I know that we ran a little bit long on the presentations. Is that all right with you, Joshua and Olga? To stay?
Yeah,
Yep.
10
Okay,
or 15,
great.
15 minutes more? Okay.
Let's do that. Great, thanks.
Cool.
Joshua, over to you.
Thank you, Andre. And I'll be quick too. I just want to say a couple of things. One of the things is that, if we think that, or if we thought that BDS was an issue, which it is, Black Lives Matter is a much larger issue. And the main reason is just because of visibility. Black Lives, if you go out into the street and ask a random person what BDS is, they probably don't know. But if you were to go out and ask that same person what Black Lives Matter is, they'll tell you. They have some sort of personal connection to it. And the reason why that's dangerous is because it's getting to a point now in the US where if you are a Black organization that says you're for justice or for social justice, there's less and less room for you to not be anti-Israel. And again, like Dan said, it's because BLM is trying to, and they're actually getting successful at this, trying to tie police brutality to Israel, police brutality in the US to Israel. And they've been able to successfully sever ties between Israel and a couple of US police departments here in a couple of major cities here in the US, Durham, North Carolina, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. They flooded their officials with phone calls, and they put a lot of pressure on them, and they severed ties, and now they're working on Atlanta. I went to an event, an anti-Israel event. I attended it on Zoom. It was held by people who are anti-Israel. Some Black Lives Matter people were represented there. And their whole thing was, again, just like I was saying in the beginning, they were accusing Israel of being responsible for police brutality with all of these accusations with no facts or any kind of basis for it. They had nothing to substantiate what they were saying, but they were saying these things. And at the end of the presentation, they said, okay, here's a script, call this number and tell them this is what you want them to do and cut ties with Israel. And there was a few hundred people on that call. And this is kind of what we're facing here now is, and with what we do here at Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, we come against those lies, absolutely. But even in a more important way, we go on the offensive and we teach, we educate, we tell people what the truth is, and we arm people with knowledge, because even though Black Lives Matter is very loud, they're not the majority, and they don't even represent the vast majority of Black Americans, even on their other platforms. There are other platforms that there was a Gallup poll that was just done about police. Black people were asked, do you want more police, less police, or the same? 81% of Black people said they want either more police or the same amount of police. Black Lives Matter stance on a few charter schools, they're anti-capitalist, they're anti-nuclear family. There are things that the vast majority of Black people don't actually support. It's just that because BLM is loud and they're on TV all the time, people get the impression that, they're representing us, but they really aren't. And so one of the things that we do as IPSI, as a Black American pro-Israel organization, is that we speak up for that. We give a platform to those other voices that are dissenting voices. We speak out as Black Americans saying, look, not only is this wrong and their stance against Israel is very sinister, but they actually don't even represent us. And that's one, I think, one of the best things, or one thing I think we can all take away from that is that for anything is that it can, there are things that can be in the news and all over social media and just everywhere all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that they represent everybody. Just like Jewish Voice for Peace doesn't represent the vast majority of Jews around the world. And I don't know if there's one in Australia, but they're an anti-Israel Jewish organization. But they represent a small minority of the Jewish population. That's what BLM is to me. People know about them, they hear about them, but they don't represent us. And we have to show people an alternative to that. And that's what IPSI is doing now with our initiative with Dan, with our education initiative and all that entails. So thank you, Andre.
Okay, thank you, Joshua. We'll move over to some questions now. Jack, I think you had the first question. If I can get you to turn your mic on and ask your question, and also who your, well, I think your question is to Dan. Sorry, I'll turn your mic on for you. There you go. Oh.
Right, good. No, thank you, Andre. Really fascinating talk today, and I thank all the speakers. One additional threat that I can see, and it's a fairly new one, it's only a couple of years old, this QAnon or QAnon, whatever it's pronounced, but it seems to be fairly right-wing, but also quite anti-Semitic. So I don't know if I'm asking at the right time at the conference, but again, it's another fairly anti-Semitic movement coming from the States. It's quite worrying.
Dan, do you, I can comment a bit on that, but let me turn you on.
Yeah, Andre, you go ahead and comment on that.
Okay, now I was just saying QAnon's been around for a few years. It's a conspiracy theory movement tied to the Pizzagate conspiracy and, going back to the last presidential election in the US. So it's a theory that there's a deep state and that that Trump is trying to dismantle people in power in America who are not acting for the interests of the country. But look, it's another conspiracy theory. It came out on various forums with coded messages, sort of like soothsayer type things that people would then interpret that, this message from a month ago was predicting the future. But, like all conspiracy theories, eventually they seem to find their roots in anti-Semitism. The secret cabal must be Jews. So yeah, that's what's going on there. Dan, I don't know if you want to.
I think Jack, I think the importance of your question also is that we're seeing a convergence of far right anti-Semitism and far left anti-Semitism, and they're meeting, and they're meeting in the middle. When you hear a Minister Louis Farrakhan, as everyone here knows, is the Nation of Islam, and he calls Jews Satan and Israel the satanic state. That is a conspiracy theory by definition, and all of you should see the BLM chapters that are subscribing publicly to Farrakhan's to Farrakhan's spiritual leadership, so-called. And all of that is based on, you remember this recent tweet war or storm in which some of the greatest influencers, Deshaun Jackson and Nick Cannon, and I mean, we're talking about tens of millions of Americans who follow these celebrities, are exposed to conspiracy theories about Jews controlling sports, Jews controlling the banks, Jews controlling coronavirus, Jews controlling everything. I mean, we're back in the 1930s in the United States. I mean, this is Father Coughlin coming from the left and the right. And I think we ought to understand that just because people use the word social justice, it doesn't mean that it's about social justice. And I think that's what makes this current campaign even more dangerous and far-reaching and complicated for us as Jews, because for us, the low-hanging fruit on anti-Semitism has always come from the far right. And now we have to look 360 degrees around us, above us, and behind us, because it is all merging. And if you want to mention the Black Hebrew, I know that Joshua Washington and Olga and Pastor Washington are great experts on the Black Hebrew movement, which is another problem. They were responsible, as you know, for the murderous attack in New Jersey in December 19, which is also part of a conspiracy that white Israelis are not really, or white Jews are not really Jews, which is what Louis Farrakhan says. Everyone on this call is not really a Jew, because only, in their view, Black Hebrews are the true Jews. So this is a convergence of conspiracy theories from all sides.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
You were referring to a question there also by John Saffron. The question, John, do you want to repeat the question for us?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it was kind of semi-answered or answered. How does Farrakhan and the Black Israelites fit into all of this?
So Dan's covered that a little bit. Joshua, Olga, Pastor Washington, do any of you want to respond further on that?
Yeah. So part of what we have facing us right now as IPSI, part of our fight, it really is on three fronts. There's political, there's cultural, and there's biblical. Farrakhan is 87 years old, and it seems like he's become more relevant now than he ever was. I remember him in the 90s. I mean, I was a kid, but he, for the most part, was kind of dismissed as like this guy who's a little off, and he's anti-Semitic, he hates Jews. And now it's almost like it's a different person. There's so much acceptance that he has publicly now. People are really bold in their supporting of him. And, he has affected the culture, which then also has been affecting our political atmosphere as well. Farrakhan and the Black Hebrew Israelites, they pull out certain parts of scripture or religious text, and they kind of reappropriate it to mean what they want it to mean, which is how you get what Dan just talked about. White Jews are fake. The real Jews are African American. That's what Black Hebrew Israelites, that's their thing. And there's really no scriptural precedent to back it up. And being a Christian and my father obviously being a pastor, there are things that, if IPSI is able to also address that front biblically as well, actually using the same scripture and saying, not only is that wrong, but there's actually a lot of precedents and a lot of scripture that talks about the Jewish diaspora. And so that's one of the things that's important. I want to also note that not only we talked about BLM a lot, but all these things are kind of connected with the celebrities that I've been tweeting, and Ice Cube, Deshaun Jackson, different rappers and other actors and celebrities who have been quoting Farrakhan. NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, huge organization. There are a couple of presidents in both Philadelphia and New Jersey who were reposting Farrakhan quotes on their page. I came after one of them in New Jersey. Turned out he was fired, but he continued. He had control over the Facebook page still, and he kept posting. And in December 2019, like Dan said, at the same time, what happened with the New Jersey shooting, what happened with the NAACP chapter president in New Jersey tweeting or posting Farrakhan stuff, the founder of BLM was at an Al Jazeera TV screening where she was talking about how they were strengthening their solidarity with Palestinian people and against Israeli genocide and apartheid. This was all happening at the same time. And so this convergence, we can't just fight on one front and ignore the others. These are all together. And that's why we're doing what we're doing, because it has to be addressed on a comprehensive scale.
Okay. Thank you, Joshua. Something I'm pretty sure I read yesterday as well. I think Farrakhan conducted the funeral service for one of the people that were, that was killed, that was at the center of the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement. Joshua, do you want to just remind us of that as well? Because that also plays into it. I don't know if you remember which one it was. I think it was it 2014? Was it?
You mean one of the victims of one of the shootings? Was it maybe Mike Brown or something like that?
I think it might have been. Yeah, I think it might have been Michael Brown.
Yeah, so Farrakhan, you know, he does have weight in the community. I mean, he had the reason why Farrakhan seems to be more relevant now, and he's continues to stay relevant, is because if you look at some of his older speeches and his older sermons, Farrakhan, outside of his Jew hatred, he actually has said some things that have benefited the Black community. Just things about personal responsibility, things about, you know, not blaming. He did this speech, I think, back in the 80s, where he talked about not blaming the white man for all your problems. You know, he really, so there are things, he's helped people get off drugs. He's actually gone into the inner city communities and has turned a lot of people's lives around in that way. And so, you know, a lot of people look to him as a father figure. And so I think a big part of the reason why you see there's silence or people tweeting and retweeting him is because there's also that emotional connection. They kind of see him as a champion of African Americans. Which is, so yeah, so it wasn't surprising to see him speak at the funeral. It wasn't surprising to see him attending the funeral of Aretha Franklin. And he sat up there on the stage with all these other civil rights leaders and former presidents, and, you know, was greeted warmly. And it's not a surprise that he's close friends with Maxine Waters and other politicians. You know, he does have a foothold in the community because of his other work. And so, you know, to attack that, you know, the Jew hatred that's coming in, the other lies that he spews, by the way, because it's not just anti-Semitism, but he says a lot of other problematic things. We have to, there has to be an alternative to him. There has to be someone or some people who are willing to actually walk with people and teach them and all those things. Because yeah, otherwise, if we come at it just intellectually, most people aren't going to really listen. And that's just really what it is.
Great, thank you. Alex Katz, you're up with your question next.
Yes, well, that's a good segue, actually, following on from that. How do you teach people? I think this question would be specifically maybe for Dan and Olga. How do you teach people in this climate when there's no objective truth, when it's hard to convince people of anything, when people don't listen to what most people say, and when there's too much media and social media going on? How do you educate people on really anything, but particularly on these important matters?
I think we'll pass that one to Olga first, because she hasn't answered a question yet.
Thank you, Andre. Alex, it's a very good question. And in fact, in many of my talks, I start with the concept of we're actually about saving truth. I don't know how many of us are familiar with the fact that in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary word of the year was post-truth. So in that definition, and to answer the first part of your question, we are living in an era where there is objective truth. People say there is no truth, but there is objective truth. However, what's happened is that objective truth, and I'm paraphrasing the definition of post-truth, has now taken a back seat to feelings. So there's a truth, we acknowledge the fact that that's truth, but because we don't feel it, because it doesn't form part of what's cool or what's a current trend, that doesn't matter. And so what's important from an educational perspective is the fact that we drill down as to here is a truth. And one of the ways in which we do that is by presenting evidence. Unfortunately, many of our young people, and it's not only young people these days, apparently, they go to Dr. Google and they stay there. Wikipedia is their first and their last resource, they stay there. Facebook is their first and last resource, and they stay there. And we can't do that. From an educational perspective that I've seen work in South Africa, my work with Daisy, and then what's also going to be happening with the project that we're doing with the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, and with Dan, if I can just very quickly go there, and you'll see that I'm very passionate about it, is the fact that we have to drill down in terms of what is truth, what is not, and there is evidence. People are too lazy, unfortunately, often to do the research, to actually see where things have been manipulated, because that's unfortunately one of the things that's been done. They'll take a small element of truth, twist it, so that it then morphs into something that doesn't exist anymore. But what's also important, Alex, is that we can't just make one statement. You're 100% correct as to why should anybody believe me? Why should they believe Josh? Why should they believe Dan? Because there are other people who will say they're as equally qualified. They hold, if you're coming from South Africa, then they'll also say that they also hold moral authority to speak on the narrative of apartheid. So it can't be a once-off with regards to Olga just speaking on that thing for one time, but she has to be in that space continuously. If you hear me out, I do presentations where I show the facts, send links. I've even challenged my audiences to say, go do research yourself and then come back to me and we'll talk about it. one of the ways that the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel is going to be approaching things is that, and I think one of your questions, if I can say that, is how do you educate people in such a climate, is that you have to acknowledge that we have a challenge. Empathize with people where they are. Acknowledge the fact that we see the pain, we see this, don't be dismissive of it. I think many a times one of the traps that we as pro-Israel advocates, or just advocates generally fall into, is because we're just so enraged as to how can you say such an absurdity, we just immediately defend. But if you acknowledge where that person is coming from, oftentimes I've seen at least, it deflates them. And then you start the conversation with them, where they are. We're going to be looking at history, the relationships between Israel and the African American community. So showing the personal links, the personal ties that actually can't be denied, because we're going to be speaking to individuals that lived in that area, individuals that wrote things in that area, but then continuing the conversation. And I say this with respect to many organizations that have done great things, particularly in the non-Jewish community, in terms of educating or trying to educate people with regards to Israel. Oftentimes the approach has been parachute in. What do I mean by parachute in? Have a one seminar, one workshop, take them to Israel. Yay! We've created Israel advocates, but we can't do that. There has to be this continuous relationship where there's continuous conversation, continuous education, and then also a support group, so that hopefully very soon, and that's our main, one of the main objectives with what we're doing, is that we won't get to a place where there are a lot of people, and they are, who know the truth in their heads, but aren't speaking out. We need more people not just to know, but to be vocally coming against what is lie and what is truth, because truth is there. And hopefully, ultimately, truth will win.
Andre,
Yep, go for it, Dan.
George has asked a question. George Foster has asked a question regarding the progressive, conservative, Reform Jewish communities. How do they deal with these issues? And I just thought I want to make what I think is a significant point here. Joshua, Olga, and I cooperated on a book called Israelophobia in the West, the hijacking of civil discourse on Israel and how to rescue it. It's available for free at jcpa.org. You can download the entire book. The purpose of the book is to expose the masking of the new anti-Semitism cloaked in what is known in Australia and in South Africa and in New Zealand, France, and United States and Canada, every country where there are Jews. It is anti-Semitism masquerading as legitimate political criticism. This is one of the major deceits that is going on in the international community, and it is cornering diaspora Jewry because human rights people, BLM, BDS, will come up to you and say, look, we're not against you. We're not anti-Semites. We just think that Israel is a genocidal, racist, illegal, illicit, imperialistic, colonialistic country. Now, that is an anti-Semitic statement because it denies the Jewish people their right to self-determination as expressed in the one and only mini-state called the State of Israel. And the IHRA definition, which is not being embraced enough in our diaspora communities, has been accepted by the major international democratic powers, specifically in Europe and the United States. This is the new standard and the new protocol for determining what is anti-Semitic and what is legitimate criticism of Israel. The vast majority of people who come up to you in Melbourne and tell you that what they're saying is legitimate criticism, and then they say Israel is a racist, genocidal country, they are only calling Israel anti-Semitic names, and you by extension, by the way, and they cannot speak factually, as Olga says, with any evidence of the types of policies that they claim that Israel undertakes. I've been here for 30 years. I don't think, as Professor Alan Dershowitz has said, and he's written in the book as well, and you will see a real variety of people, of backgrounds, Ethiopian Israelis, Black Americans, Black South African intellectuals such as Olga, women and men all over the spectrum. But you will not find any country in the situation that Israel is in that shows a more liberal approach to tremendous complexities in a democratic state as Israel. So we invite, as everyone on this call knows, because you've all been to Israel many times, Israel is the most self-critical country probably on the face of the earth. And that's great. And we're not perfect, and we should get better, and there are all kinds of things we can do better. but be very wary that people say we're not anti-Semitic, we just think that Israel's a genocidal, rights violating apartheid state, because that by definition is anti-Semitism, and that's why I think you should take a look at the Israelophobia book, because that spells it out in black and white.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Ed Brown asked a question earlier. Ed, if you want to explain it in a bit more detail, your question was, does reciprocity matter? Can I throw it to you? Yep.
It's David Knoll here, actually, just masquerading on his screen.
Fair enough.
Earlier on, we discussed the problem of many Jewish leaders speaking up for BLM and black leaders not speaking up for Jewish causes. And a question really that has to be addressed is not do Black Lives matter, but does reciprocity matter?
So maybe back to Olga. Sorry, let's go Olga first on that one, and then Joshua.
Absolutely, reciprocity matters. I think that one of the lies that is now being perpetuated, whether directly or by implication, is the fact that the Jewish community has never stood with the black community. Josh will tell you that the black community has been arm in arms with the Jewish community from the beginning. I can say the same thing with regards to Africa. When African countries were liberated from colonialism in the 1950s, 1960s, the country that had the most number of embassies after the United States on the African continent was the state of Israel. Israel built our hospitals, our roads. I can go on and on and on. The unfortunate lie, however, in our current climate is that in order to support black people, you have to support Black Lives Matter. That's a lie. There are many other ways of supporting black people, of supporting their causes, of showing solidarity, of showing reciprocity. I haven't had coffee, my tongue got twisted there, with regards to appreciating the various challenges that exist. There are many grassroots organizations that are doing incredible work to really, really improve the lives of black people, and BLM with respect is not one of those. But equally also on the other side, what we've seen unfortunately is that there are fewer and fewer black communities that are continuing to stand with the Jewish community. I mean, now those of us that are black that know the truth should be standing up in our numbers and speaking out against what's happening, and actually standing with our Jewish brothers and sisters across the world with regards to the rise in anti-Semitism. Many of the unfortunate incidents that have happened, particularly in New York, has been met by silence from the black community, and that's unfortunate. So there's work to do on both sides, but again, if I can encourage people within the Jewish community that are wanting to stand with black people, there are many resources. Joshua's more familiar with them, and I'm sure that he'll give a couple of examples, whether directly now or he'll email them to you, Andre, and you can distribute them. So we appreciate the help, but ladies and gents, Black Lives Matter isn't the only place.
Okay, thank you, Olga. Joshua, maybe you can do that for us now.
Sure. So one of the ones that I listed in one of my last articles about Black Lives Matter is called the Robert Woodson, or it's called the Woodson Center. Robert Woodson, he's an older man. He's been doing this for a few decades now. he has these centers where it's both anti-violence, anti-gang violence. And his organization helps get people off the streets, keep them off the streets, give them proper tools they need to be successful in school and all these things. So his is really about upward mobility. Robert Woodson is his name. That's a good organization. Another one, there are a few other organizations that deal specifically with in that similar vein, education. There's one organization that's called Zion Learning, and that one actually I know that one personally. She's a good friend of mine. She and her name's Lavonda. Her and her husband run that organization together. And again, that is like a home. It's a supplement to, I think that's the right word. It's a supplement to traditional schooling. So they give them additional education to help mostly, and they have mostly black kids in their organization, giving them additional education to help them to be better equipped for school, to get prepared for college. Because oftentimes, if black kids are in a bad district with a public school that's struggling, they may do well in that school, but then they come to college and they're underprepared, which contributes to us either dropping out or just not doing well in college. Those are the two off the top of my head right now. And I can send some more. There's some, like I said, just like Zion Learning, there are those that are closer to me because I know personally the people who run it, who do great things. And my opinion is that one of the biggest ways as a Black community that we can move forward in this country, or I should say too, is our economic freedom and education. When we can learn those things, I think we can be unstoppable as a people. And I think that's something that actually resonates with a majority of Black people. Our hope and my hope personally is just that sentiment can ring out, that can get out, because that, to me, that truly will help us to move forward.
Okay. I'm not sure how we're doing for time here. I've noticed people are dropping out rapidly at this point. We should probably call it a day.
Yeah, we should wrap it up.
Can I ask each of our speakers if they want to make one final comment, one sentence or so, and then we'll call it a night, or a day, as the case may be. Let's start with Dan.
I want to thank you very much, Andre, for hosting us, and also to all of our friends in Melbourne. We're standing at a watershed moment here, I think, for diaspora Jewry, when we see what is unfolding in the United States. And I think that we all, at the same time, can take, I think, a lot of hope in what's happening between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The entire paradigm for peace in the Middle East has changed. We have been saying for years at the Jerusalem Center that Middle Eastern countries act according to their vital national interests. It is not the Palestinian issue that will define peace in the Middle East. And the UAE has really stepped up to the plate, much to the chagrin of the Palestinian leadership, and said that's very much the case. That doesn't mean that we don't want to solve the Palestinian issue. We do. But then again, they refused 6 consecutive offers for peace and for statehood next to the state of Israel. So we are optimistic in Israel, and I hope that optimism echoes over down under, as they say, because I think we have real reason to be optimistic in the Middle East, and we'll see other Arab countries stepping up to the plate. So there really is a pathway to regional peace here, and we all need to stand together. On the one hand, opposite the BDS BLM political movement. On the other hand, always fighting on behalf of anti-racism and being very optimistic about where Israel is and will be, God willing, with its Arab neighbors in the coming weeks, months, and years.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Olga next. Final thoughts?
I also just want to echo Dan's thanks for this particular panel. If I could quote or read out a quote by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs: "The hate that begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews." That is what today I want us to understand. It wasn't the Jews alone who suffered under Hitler. It wasn't the Jews alone who suffered under Stalin. We make a great mistake if we think that anti-Semitism is a threat only to the Jews. And why do I say that in my closing remarks? This particular battle for truth and the growing anti-Semitism, despite where it might be lurking, despite the organizations that may seem to take on this narrative, even though they are supposedly helping out various other communities, it's a real plight, something that we need to work with together, because at the end of the day, it's not only doing a disservice to, in this instance, starting with the Jews, the Jewish community in the diaspora as well, but then also in this instance with Black Lives Matter, to the Black community here in the United States. There was a question that we didn't get an opportunity to speak to. It's doing a disservice to Africans that are still enslaved in slavery, because there has been this cloak as to who the actual perpetrators are. And then it's also doing an injustice to the Palestinian people. So we really do have an obligation to ensure that we speak up where we see wrong, even though it might be against the popular trend.
Okay, thank you, Olga. Joshua, final thoughts? Sorry, you're...
Unmute myself there. Thank you so much for having us. It was an honor to come. I wish I could actually be there in person, but it was an honor to at least see you all. And yeah, I just want to end by saying, no, I mean, this fight for truth is on many fronts, like we were saying. Please join our mailing list. I just put it in the chat. Go on the website. You can join our mailing list there, because I want to keep you guys up to date on the educational venture that we're taking with Dan Diker, and ways that you can actually help us get that going. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Joshua. I think that chat message may have gone to an individual rather than everyone. You might want to just resend to everyone. And if I can pass over now to Peter Wertheim from ECAJ to close us off for the night.
Well, thank you, and JCCV for organising this really important talk. This is a topic I think we're going to be hearing much more about as time goes on. We've already heard a fair bit about it, but this is an insight that we would never have had but for our three speakers. And I especially want to thank Olga, Joshua and Dan for inculcating us into, or introducing us into this whole world of BLM, which, I mean, it's kind of perplexing all the way here from Australia. We don't see it with quite the same manifestation as it's presented itself in the United States. But it's certainly something that's attracted our notice, and it's certainly something that's been picked up on or attempted to be picked up on by pro-Palestinian groups here. And we're also very concerned because just as we see the whole narrative about Israel as a colonialist, apartheid, settler state being promulgated as a way of delegitimizing the very concept of a Jewish state, here in the diaspora, we see the parallel tendency of characterizing Jews as part of a privileged white elite and delegitimizing the very concept of anti-Semitism. So this is something perhaps for another day and something we'd like to learn more about. But we're deeply indebted to all three of you for your insights and for the time you've taken and for initiating us into this really important subject, which I'm sure, as I said earlier, we're going to hear a lot more about. So thank you all three of you for a wonderful presentation, wonderful presentations, and for answering our questions.
Okay, so that concludes our evening. Thank you again to our speakers and to everyone that's joined us, and also to those who have asked questions. We'll see you next time.